When the Galactic Survival Institute needs to prove a point about mortality, they don't mess around with gentle reminders or strongly worded memos. They build a death trap on Ixthanor Prime, a planet where the Welcome Committee consists entirely of things that want to eat you before you finish reading the warning signs. The Predator Gauntlet wasn't just the galaxy's most notorious survival challenge. It was a masterclass in creative extinction, wrapped up in official paperwork, and served with a side of statistical inevitability. Every major civilization had sent their finest warriors here to prove their species' superiority, and every single one had become part of the local food chain with remarkable consistency. Commander Bextal Norik stood on the observation deck, his scarred hide telling stories of 1,000 battles where he'd been the one doing the surviving. 3 Eyes, the fourth, had been a casualty of his younger, stupider days, surveyed the killing field below with the professional detachment of someone who'd seen more spectacular failures than a dating app algorithm. 12 candidates this cycle, his aide announced, tentacles twitching with what passed for excitement among his species. The betting pools are already predicting total extinction within 48 hours. Bextal snorted, a sound like grinding metal that somehow conveyed both amusement and profound disappointment in the galaxy's collective intelligence. 48 hours? Optimistic. The last batch didn't make it past lunch on day 1. The candidates had been arriving all morning, each species determined to prove their superiority over every other species that had ever existed, would exist, or had the audacity to think about existing. It was a parade of galactic arrogance that would have been entertaining if it weren't so predictably fatal. First came the Velthari delegation, their crystalline exoskeletons gleaming like disco balls of death. They'd brought enough firepower to level a small moon, and the kind of confidence that only comes from never having met anything they couldn't shatter with their diamond-hard appendages. Their champion, a towering construct of living mineral called Hexarios, moved with the subtle grace of a geological formation having a seizure. Beautiful, Bextal muttered. Absolutely beautiful. Nothing says apex predator bait quite like announcing your presence with enough light reflection to blind a small star. The Roxmani contingent arrived next, their cybernetic enhancements humming with enough processing power to calculate the exact trajectory of their inevitable doom. They'd replaced so much of their original biology with machinery that they were basically smartphones with delusions of grandeur. Their representative sported enough weapons integration to stock a small armory and the personality of a particularly aggressive toaster. Then came the Cuvex Collective, a hive mind so convinced of their own intellectual superiority that they'd brought backup brains in jars, just in case their primary consciousness needed technical support while being digested. The collective thought in unison, moved in unison, and would undoubtedly die in unison, which would at least make the cleanup easier. Grixmund the Destroyer lumbered in with all the subtlety of a volcanic eruption, having an anxiety attack. Standing nearly 3 meters tall and built like a tank that had been hitting the gym religiously, he was the Hectare system's answer to the question, what if we made a living weapon and gave it anger management issues? His species had evolved on a world where the weather tried to kill you, the plants tried to kill you, and the minerals in the ground tried to kill you just for existing near them. Naturally, this had made them excellent at killing things, but terrible at recognizing when they were about to become the things being killed. High Strategist Ulvera glided in with her 4 arms orchestrating some kind of tactical analysis in real time, probably calculating the optimal method for her own spectacular demise. The Wyxeloran Empire's finest strategic mind was a walking computer dedicated to the art of warfare, which was adorable considering that warfare required opponents who followed rules, used logic, or cared about tactical superiority. The local wildlife didn't read military manuals. But then came the human. Finn Ortega walked into the staging area like he'd taken a wrong turn looking for the botanical gardens. No fanfare, no military escort, no cybernetic enhancements gleaming in the artificial light. Just a worn backpack that had seen more adventures than most galactic explorers. a machete that looked like it had been forged sometime around the invention of disappointment, and an expression that suggested he was mildly curious about the local flora. The other candidates took one look at this unremarkable specimen and began calculating how quickly they could claim his gear after the inevitable happened. Here was a species that had barely figured out interstellar travel, sending what appeared to be a gardener to face off against Ixthanor Prime's apex predators. It was like watching someone bring a butter knife to a chainsaw fight, except the chainsaw was invisible, highly intelligent, and had millions of years of evolutionary refinement in the art of creative murder. Is that... Bextal's aide consulted his datapad, tentacles practically vibrating with disbelief. Is that really their champion? The human. Bextal studied Finn through the observation port, his 3 remaining eyes narrowing with professional interest. In his long career of watching superior beings become inferior corpses, he'd learned to spot the subtle signs that separated the merely doomed from the spectacularly doomed. This human was displaying none of the usual patterns. No preening, no weapon checks, no intimidation displays or ritualistic preparations for glorious death. Instead, Finn was examining a potted plant someone had left near the staging area, muttering to himself in what sounded like botanical terminology. "Look at him." Grixmund's voice boomed across the staging area, his species' natural volume set permanently to earthquake warning. "The human thinks he's here for a nature walk. I almost feel bad about how quickly this will end." Oliveira's forearms moved in calculating gestures as she analyzed the competition. Statistically, the human represents the greatest deviation from combat optimal parameters I've ever recorded. No enhanced physiology, minimal technological augmentation, and gear that appears to have been purchased at what humans call a garage sale. I calculate his survival probability at approximately 0.003%. The QVEX collective buzzed with shared amusement, their hive mind reaching a consensus that the human's presence was either a clerical error or some kind of elaborate joke. They communicated their collective dismissal through a series of harmonic tones that roughly translated to, "How adorable, the monkey brought gardening tools." Finn, oblivious to the galactic scale condescension being directed his way, had moved on from the potted plant to examining the atmospheric readings on a nearby display panel. He nodded approvingly, like someone who just confirmed that yes, the air was indeed suitable for breathing, which was a relief because he'd planned on doing quite a bit of that in the near future. "Candidates!" Bextal's voice crackled through the communication system, cutting through the various species' preparations for inevitable glory or doom. "You have been selected to face the ultimate test of survival, cunning, and sheer bloody-minded refusal to become something else's dinner. Ixthanor Prime's ecosystem has been perfected over millions of years to provide the most comprehensive death experience available in this sector of the galaxy." He paused, letting that sink in while watching the various candidates respond with everything from aggressive posturing to what looked like religious preparations for the afterlife. The Shade Stalker is Ixthanor's apex predator. It has never, and I mean never, failed to eliminate its prey. It is invisible, patient, intelligent, and utterly without mercy. It studies your weaknesses, adapts to your strategies, and strikes when you least expect it. In the past 5 cycles, we have sent 68 of the galaxy's finest warriors, strategists, and enhanced beings into its domain. Another pause, this one heavy with the weight of galactic scale failure. None have survived past the 3rd day. Most don't survive past the 3rd hour. The staging area fell silent, except for the various sounds of species-specific anxiety. Chittering, humming, mechanical whirring, and what sounded like Grixmund cracking his knuckles, which produced a sound like boulders having a disagreement. Finn raised his hand. "Yes?" Bextal's voice carried a note of curiosity that his subordinates had learned to fear. "Quick question. Are there any restrictions on interacting with the local plant life? I mean, assuming it's not actively trying to dissolve me or anything." The staging area erupted in what could charitably be called laughter, if laughter could be produced by beings who found the concept of humor to be a tactical disadvantage. Grixmund's booming guffaws shook loose some ceiling tiles, while Ulvera's four-armed gesture language spelled out what appeared to be the tactical equivalent of, "You have got to be kidding me." Bextal stared at the human for a long moment, his three eyes blinking in sequence like a biological error message trying to process an impossible input. "The plant life," he said slowly, "is part of the ecosystem. Everything on Ixthanor Prime is part of the test. Everything." "Cool." Finn nodded, shouldering his ancient backpack with the satisfied air of someone who just confirmed that the local salad bar was open for business. "Just wanted to make sure I wasn't going to accidentally violate any environmental protection protocols." Environmental protection protocols. On a planet where the environmental protection consisted mainly of protecting the environment from running out of creative ways to kill visitors. Bextal made a sound that might have been laughter if laughter could be produced by someone whose faith in the universe's basic sanity had been systematically murdered over decades of professional disappointment. "Candidates, you will be transported to separate entry points in the hunting preserve. Your objective is simple: survive. The test ends when either you emerge from the preserve after 10 days, or when you join the extensive collection of previous candidates who have become part of Ixthanor's nutrient cycle." The transport platforms hummed to life, each one calibrated to deliver its passenger to a different section of the preserve. As the candidates took their positions, the betting pools transmitted their final odds across the galactic networks. Grixmund the Destroyer, 15-1 against survival. High Strategist Ulvera, 22-1 against survival. The Cuvex Collective, 31-1 against survival. Hexarios the Crystalline Warrior, 18-1 against survival. Finn Ortega, the human with the gardening tools, 847-1 against survival. Some betting pools had stopped taking wagers on the human entirely, declaring it unsporting to accept money for what was essentially a guarantee. As the transport platforms engaged and the candidates disappeared into Ixthanor's green hell, Bextal settled back to watch another cycle of galactic hubris meet planetary reality. In his experience, the entertainment usually lasted about 6 hours, before degenerating into the kind of screaming that made even his species' younglings hide under their sleeping pods. But something about the human nagged at him. In all his years of watching superior beings become inferior, fertilizer, he'd never seen anyone react to mortal danger by asking about gardening permissions. "Sir," his aide ventured, tentacles twitching with curiosity, "should we prepare the standard condolence messages for the various homeworlds?" Bextal considered this, his scarred hide rippling with what passed for thoughtfulness among his kind. "Prepare them," he said finally, "but maybe hold off on sending the humans for a few hours. I have a feeling this cycle might be different." His aide's tentacles nearly tied themselves in knots with surprise. In 15 years of service, he'd never heard the commander suggest that any candidate might last longer than statistical probability suggested. Far below, in the green depths of Ixthanor Prime, 12 candidates began their dance with death. 11 of them brought weapons, strategy, and the confidence of species that had conquered worlds. One brought a backpack full of plant identification guides and the kind of practical wisdom that comes from growing up in places where everything green wants to kill you. But if you ask it nicely, sometimes it'll kill your enemies instead. The transport platforms had barely finished materializing their passengers before Ixthanor Prime began its welcoming ceremony, which consisted mainly of everything in a 50-meter radius suddenly going very, very quiet. This was the kind of silence that suggested the local wildlife had spotted the new arrivals and was currently deciding which appetizer looked most promising. Commander Bextal settled into his observation chair with the satisfied air of someone about to watch a particularly expensive fireworks display. 12 monitoring screens flickered to life, each one tracking a different candidate through the preserve's sensor network. In his experience, the first hour usually provided the best entertainment before things devolved into the predictable screaming and dying. Candidate tracking active, his aide announced, tentacles dancing across the control interface. All biometric monitors functional. Betting pools have locked in their final odds. Excellent, Bextal rumbled, his three eyes scanning the displays with professional interest. Let's see which one provides the most educational death this time. Screen 1 showed Hexarios, the crystalline Velthari warrior, stomping through the undergrowth with all the stealth of a landslide having a tantrum. His diamond-hard exoskeleton caught every stray beam of sunlight and threw it back in brilliant flashes that could probably be seen from orbit. The local plant life was already responding to his presence, or more accurately, fleeing from it in patterns that suggested even the vegetation had developed a healthy respect for things that glittered ominously. Interesting approach, Bextal mused. Nothing says apex predator bait quite like turning yourself into a walking beacon of fresh meat available here. Screen 2 displayed the Roxmani candidate, whose cybernetic enhancements were currently running a full environmental analysis while simultaneously charging 17 different weapon systems. The constant electronic humming from his augmentations was creating a technological symphony that every predator within 5 kilometers could probably use as a dinner bell. Grixmund the Destroyer occupied Screen 3, and true to his name, he was already destroying things. Trees mostly, along with several large rocks that had apparently offended him by existing in his path. His species' solution to environmental challenges seemed to involve hitting them repeatedly until they stopped being challenges. It was a strategy that had worked brilliantly on his homeworld, where everything was already trying to kill everything else. So a little extra violence just blended into the background noise. Ah, the direct approach. Bextal nodded approvingly. I give him 4 hours before something bigger and hungrier takes exception to his landscaping techniques. High strategist Ulvera was visible on Screen 4, her forearms weaving complex tactical calculations while she mapped potential ambush points, escape routes, and defensive positions. Her strategic brilliance was immediately apparent. She'd identified 18 different ways the local terrain could be used against her, and was already developing countermeasures for each one. Unfortunately, she was thinking like a military strategist facing an opponent that followed military logic. The Shadestalker had never attended tactical school. The Q-Vex collective buzzed with shared consciousness across Screen 5. Their hive mind processing environmental data at superhuman speeds while maintaining perfect formation. They moved like a single organism, thought like a single organism, and would undoubtedly die like a single organism, which would make the paperwork much easier. But it was Screen 12 that caught Bextal's attention and held it. Finn Ortega had landed in a small clearing and was currently examining flowers, not scanning for threats, not checking weapon systems, not calculating tactical advantages. He was crouched next to a cluster of purple blooms, pulling out what appeared to be a battered field guide and comparing illustrations to the actual plants. Is he? Bextal's aide paused, tentacles twitching with confusion. Is he cataloging the local flora? It appears so, Bextal replied, his 3 eyes blinking in sequence as his brain tried to process this unprecedented behavior. In 30 years of running these tests, I have never seen a candidate stop to identify wildflowers. Finn stood up, brushed dirt off his knees, and made a note in a worn notebook before moving deeper into the forest. His movements were relaxed, unhurried, like someone taking a pleasant stroll through a park rather than entering a preserve specifically designed to kill him in creative ways. Should we check his biometrics? The aide asked. Maybe the human is experiencing some kind of psychological break? Extreme fear can manifest as denial of reality in some species. Bextal studied the readings. Heart rate, steady. Stress hormones, well within normal parameters. Brain activity, focused but not panicked. Either Finn Ortega was the most psychologically stable being ever to enter the preserve, or he was operating under a completely different set of assumptions about what constituted mortal danger. Meanwhile, the other candidates were beginning their encounters with Ixthanor's hospitality. Hexarios was the first to make contact, The crystalline warrior had been methodically vaporizing suspicious-looking vegetation with his plasma projectors when the undergrowth exploded into motion around him. The Shadestalker's opening gambit was subtle. A few snapped branches here, a rustle of leaves there, just enough to suggest movement without revealing position. Hexarios responded with overwhelming firepower, turning a 30-meter radius around his position into a crater of superheated glass and carbon. It was an impressive display of destructive capability that accomplished absolutely nothing except announcing his exact location to every predator on the continent. "Classic mistake," Bextal observed. "He's fighting the environment instead of the predator. The Shadestalker is probably watching this from a safe distance and taking notes on his weapon's recharge cycles." Sure enough, the real attack came 20 minutes later when Hexarios was recharging his primary weapons. The Shadestalker materialized behind him like a nightmare-given form, 6 meters of evolved killing machine that moved with liquid grace despite its massive size. The crystalline warrior had exactly enough time to register the creature's presence before razor-sharp claws found the weak points between his exoskeleton plates. Screen 1 went dark. "Hexarios eliminated," the aide announced with professional detachment. "Time of death, 43 minutes, 15 seconds. Cause, massive trauma to primary life support systems." "Sloppy," Bextal grunted. "The Velthari always rely too heavily on their armor. They forget that every defense has a weakness, and the Shadestalker has had millions of years to figure out what those weaknesses are." The Roxmani candidate lasted slightly longer, mainly because his cybernetic enhancements provided early warning when the Shadestalker began its approach. His response was tactically sound. Establish a defensive perimeter, maximize sensor coverage, and engage at maximum range with overwhelming firepower. It might have worked against a conventional predator. The Shadestalker was many things, but conventional wasn't one of them. The creature's camouflage wasn't just visual. It could modulate its heat signature, electromagnetic emissions, and even its scent to blend seamlessly with the environment. The Roxmani's sensors detected threats everywhere and nowhere, painting target locks on shadows, wind patterns, and at one point, a particularly suspicious-looking rock. When the attack came, it wasn't from any direction the sensors had predicted. The Shadestalker dropped from above, having spent 2 hours patiently climbing trees and calculating trajectories. The cybernetic warrior managed to get off 3 shots before electromagnetic claws shorted out his primary systems and gravity took care of the rest. Screen 2 flickered and died. 51 minutes, 32 seconds, the aide reported. The Roxmani lasted longer than predicted, but still fell victim to tactical inflexibility. His technology made him predictable. Grixmund, the destroyer's encounter, was the most spectacular, mainly because it involved approximately 4 square kilometers of forest getting thoroughly destroyed before the inevitable conclusion. His species' approach to problem-solving was straightforward. Identify threat, apply maximum violence, repeat until threat ceases to exist, or you do. The Shadestalker seemed almost amused by this strategy. Instead of engaging directly, it led Grixmund on a destructive tour of the preserve, always staying just out of range while the warrior demolished everything in sight. Trees older than most civilizations became collateral damage. Ancient rock formations got redesigned, and several small hills were relocated entirely. By the time Grixmund realized he was being played, he'd exhausted his energy reserves and carved a path of destruction that could be seen from orbit. The Shadestalker's final attack was almost anticlimactic, a simple ambush when the warrior paused to catch his breath. Screen 3 went black. 1 hour, 18 minutes, the aide noted. Impressive stamina, but ultimately fell victim to resource management failure. High strategist Ulvera's demise was perhaps the most tragic, because her analysis was absolutely correct. Her four-armed tactical calculations had identified the Shadestalker's probable location, movement patterns, and attack strategies with remarkable accuracy. Her defensive preparations were textbook perfect, her positioning was optimal, and her contingency plans covered every conceivable scenario. Unfortunately, she was playing chess against an opponent that didn't know the rules existed. The Shade Stalker ignored conventional tactical doctrine entirely, approaching from angles that made no strategic sense, using attack patterns that violated every principle of efficient hunting, and generally behaving like a creature that had evolved beyond the need to follow anybody's playbook. Ulvera's brilliant mind spent precious seconds trying to reconcile the creature's impossible behavior with known tactical principles. Those seconds were all the Shade Stalker needed. Screen 4 died with a flicker. 2 hours, 43 minutes, the aide recorded. Longest survival time this cycle, but still fell victim to overthinking the problem. The QVEX Collective's elimination was uniquely horrifying because it happened in stages. The hive mind's strength was also its weakness. When the Shade Stalker began picking off individual members, their shared consciousness experienced each death simultaneously. The surviving members' coordination degraded with each loss, their collective intelligence fragmenting as fear and pain cascaded through their neural links. By the end, the last surviving QVEX was essentially catatonic, overwhelmed by the psychic trauma of experiencing multiple deaths from the inside. The Shade Stalker's final attack was almost merciful. Screen 5 went dark, followed by Screen 6 through 11 in rapid succession as the remaining candidates met their various spectacular ends. Total elimination of 11 candidates, the aide announced. Average survival time, 1 hour, 32 minutes. Slightly below the seasonal average, but well within expected parameters. Bextal nodded, then froze as he realized what his aide had said. 11 candidates? We started with 12. Both of them turned to Screen 12, which was still very much active. Finn Ortega was currently sitting cross-legged next to a small stream, eating what appeared to be a sandwich while making notes in his field guide. He'd collected samples of several plants and was methodically cataloging their properties, completely oblivious to the fact that he was now the sole survivor of what had been a dozen of the galaxy's most dangerous beings. How? The aide's tentacles moved in patterns that indicated complete cognitive failure. How is he still alive? The Shade Stalker should have found him hours ago. Bextal studied the screen with growing fascination. The human wasn't hiding, wasn't running, wasn't showing any signs of stress or awareness that he was being hunted by the most efficient predator on the planet. He was just botanizing, like he was on some kind of research expedition rather than fighting for his life. Pull up the Shade Stalker's tracking data, Bextal ordered. The tactical display flickered to life, showing the creature's movement patterns throughout the day. 11 kill sites were marked in red, showing the systematic elimination of each candidate. But there was something odd about the pattern around Finn's location. The Shade Stalker had approached the human's area multiple times, but had never closed the distance for an attack. Interesting, Bextal murmured. It's like the creature is avoiding him? That's impossible, the aide protested. The Shade Stalker has never avoided prey. It's neurologically incapable of backing down from a hunt. They watched as Finn finished his meal, carefully packed away his sandwich wrapper. Apparently the human believed in leaving no trace even in a death trap, and began walking deeper into the forest. His movements were still relaxed, unhurried, as if he was taking a pleasant nature walk rather than venturing into the domain of a creature that had just eliminated 11 superior opponents. Sir, the aide said slowly, I'm detecting some unusual chemical signatures in the human's vicinity. The atmospheric analyzers are registering compounds that don't match the baseline environmental readings. Bextal's three eyes narrowed. What kind of compounds? Unknown. The computer is having trouble categorizing them. They appear to be plant-based, but not from any species in our database. On Screen 12, Finn knelt next to another flower, made another note, and collected another sample. He moved with the confident efficiency of someone who knew exactly what they were looking for and was finding it. How long until nightfall? Bextal asked. 3 hours, sir. Good. That's when the real test begins. The Shade Stalker is most active after dark, and nowhere near as patient as it was during the day. But even as he said it, Bextal found himself wondering if the conventional wisdom about Ixthanor Prime's apex predator was about to be challenged by a human with a backpack full of plant samples and an attitude that suggested he was exactly where he wanted to be. For the first time in 30 years of running the Predator Gauntlet, Commander Bextal was genuinely curious about what would happen next. Nightfall on Ixthanor Prime wasn't just the absence of light, it was the presence of something far more sinister. The temperature dropped, the humidity spiked, and every sound in the forest took on the quality of a death rattle echoing through a cathedral of carnivorous trees. Bextal had dismissed his aide hours ago, settling in for what he expected to be the final act of another predictable tragedy. The human couldn't possibly survive what was coming. Nothing survived the Shadestalker after dark, but Finn Ortega wasn't behaving like prey that understood its place in the food chain. While the commander watched in growing bewilderment, the human had spent the afternoon engaged in what could only be described as aggressive gardening. Not the peaceful, contemplative kind that involved watering and pruning, but the kind that involved grinding plants into paste, mixing mysterious concoctions, and applying the results to his clothing, skin, and equipment with the methodical precision of someone following a very specific recipe. "What the hell is he doing?" Bextal muttered to the empty observation deck. The atmospheric sensors were having a nervous breakdown trying to categorize the chemical soup Finn was creating. The readings showed compounds that shouldn't exist, molecular combinations that violated several principles of basic chemistry, and scent signatures that made the computer's threat assessment protocols throw up error messages and suggest a complete system restart. Finn had turned himself into a walking chemistry experiment. The revelation hit Bextal like a meteorite to the frontal lobe. The human wasn't trying to fight the Shadestalker. He was trying to confuse it. Every predator in the galaxy relied on some combination of visual, thermal, electromagnetic, or chemical tracking. Finn was systematically corrupting every single sensory input the creature might use to identify him as prey. The plant paste he'd smeared on his clothes was releasing pheromones that mimicked at least 6 different species of local herbivores, 3 types of scavenger, and something that the computer tentatively identified as aggressive fungal spore with territorial issues. His heat signature was masked by compounds that either absorbed or redirected thermal radiation, and the electromagnetic interference from his various botanical concoctions was creating a sensor shadow that made him effectively invisible to anything relying on bioelectric field detection. "Clever," Bextal admitted grudgingly, "but temporary. The Shadestalker will adapt. It always adapts." As if summoned by his words, the creature materialized at the edge of Finn's clearing. 6 meters of evolutionary perfection, moving with liquid grace through the undergrowth, its chameleonic hide shifting through patterns that hurt to look at directly. The apex predator of Ixthanor Prime had arrived to claim its final victim, and stopped. The Shadestalker's massive head turned slowly, sampling the air with sensory organs that could detect the heartbeat of a mouse from a kilometer away. But instead of the focused intensity of a predator that had located its prey, the creature displayed something Bextal had never seen before: confusion. Finn was sitting by his small campfire, completely oblivious to the 6-meter death machine studying him from 20 meters away. He was grinding more plant material in a makeshift mortar, occasionally adding drops of liquid from various bottles he'd filled at the stream. The scents wafting from his impromptu chemistry lab would have made a professional perfumer weep with envy and terror. The Shadestalker circled the clearing 3 times, its movements becoming increasingly agitated. Every time it approached from a new angle, Finn's chemical camouflage presented a different sensory profile. To the creature's highly evolved hunting instincts, the human wasn't registering as prey, predator, or any recognizable category of living thing. He was a biological impossibility that smelled like everything and nothing simultaneously. "This is unprecedented," Bextal whispered to himself. "Absolutely unprecedented." But Finn wasn't finished. As the Shadestalker's confusion deepened, the human began the second phase of his plan. He started releasing spores. Not just any spores. These were carefully selected fungal agents that Finn had identified from his Amazon experience as having psychoactive properties when inhaled by large predators. The spores were invisible, odorless, and spread through the clearing on the night breeze like microscopic messengers of neurological chaos. The effect on the shade stalker was immediate and dramatic. The creature's movements became less coordinated, its camouflage patterns shifted erratically, and its sensory organs began providing conflicting information about everything in its environment. For a predator that relied on perfect sensory integration to function, it was like being suddenly struck deaf, blind, and dizzy all at once. Finn looked up from his plant grinding, noticed the large shadowy mass stumbling around his clearing, and did something that made Bextal question his understanding of human psychology. He waved. "Hey there, big guy," Finn called out cheerfully. "You okay? You seem a little disoriented." The shade stalker's head swiveled toward the sound, its movements now clumsy and uncertain. The spores were doing their work, disrupting the neural pathways that controlled the creature's hunting instincts, while leaving its basic motor functions mostly intact. What happened next redefined everything Bextal thought he knew about predator-prey relationships. Finn stood up, approached the massive creature with the casual confidence of someone greeting a neighbor's dog, and began examining its disoriented state with clinical interest. "Fungal spores affecting your inner ear? Yeah, that'll do it," he said conversationally, reaching into his backpack. "Lucky for you, I know just the thing." He pulled out a handful of leaves that he'd been saving for exactly this moment, a natural antidote that would counteract the psychoactive effects while leaving the creature calm and non-aggressive. It was a trick he'd learned from studying how certain Amazon tribes dealt with large predators. Sometimes the best way to survive an encounter wasn't to kill or flee, but to temporarily disable the threat and then help it recover. As Finn began preparing the antidote, Bextal realized he was witnessing something that would require him to rewrite every manual on predator behavior in the Galactic database. The human wasn't just surviving the ultimate test, he was giving the apex predator of Ixthanor Prime emergency veterinary care. What followed was perhaps the most surreal hour in the history of interstellar predator studies. Finn Ortega, armed with nothing but botanical knowledge and the kind of calm confidence that came from growing up in a place where the trees occasionally tried to eat you, proceeded to give emergency medical care to the most feared predator in the galaxy. He approached the disoriented shade stalker like a veterinarian making house calls, completely ignoring the fact that this particular patient had razor-sharp claws the size of combat knives and teeth that could bite through starship hull plating. "Easy now," Finn murmured, mixing his antidote with the practiced ease of someone who'd done this before. "I know you're feeling pretty rough right now, but this'll help clear your head." The shade stalker, still reeling from the psychoactive spores, allowed this tiny bipedal creature to approach within arm's reach. Up close, Finn could see the magnificent complexity of the creature's biology, adaptive camouflage cells that shifted like liquid mercury, sensory organs that could probably detect individual molecules, and a muscular structure that represented millions of years of evolutionary fine-tuning. "You're absolutely beautiful," Finn said with genuine admiration, carefully applying the herbal remedy to the creature's nasal passages. "No wonder you've been so successful. Your neurochemistry is incredibly sophisticated." Bextal watched this impossible scene unfold with a growing certainty that he was either having a psychotic break or witnessing something that would require him to rewrite every training manual in the Galactic Survival Institute's database. The human was petting the apex predator, actually petting it like it was some kind of oversized house cat with abandonment issues. The antidote worked with remarkable efficiency. Within minutes, the shade stalker's movements became more coordinated, its camouflage pattern stabilized, and its sensory organs began functioning normally again. But instead of immediately resuming its hunt, the creature did something unprecedented. It sat down. 6 meters of perfect killing machine settled onto its haunches and regarded Finn with what could only be described as curiosity. The human had just poisoned it, then cured it, then complemented its evolutionary design. From the Shade Stalker's perspective, this was either the most elaborate hunting strategy it had ever encountered, or something entirely outside its experience. "There we go," Finn said, stepping back to admire his handiwork. "Feeling better? Good. Now, I know this is probably confusing for you, but I need you to understand something important." The Shade Stalker's head tilted slightly, and Bextal could swear the creature was actually listening. "I'm not prey," Finn continued conversationally. "I'm not a predator either. I'm something your beautiful brain hasn't categorized yet. I'm a collaborator. Where I come from, we learned a long time ago that the jungle doesn't have to be your enemy if you know how to speak its language." Finn reached into his backpack and pulled out a collection of fruits he'd gathered during his botanical tour. They were local species, carefully selected for their nutritional content and appeal to large carnivores. He placed them on the ground between himself and the Shade Stalker in what was unmistakably a peace offering. "These are high in the amino acids your species needs," he explained. "Better than whatever you'd get from eating me, and without all the unpleasant struggle. Plus, I've been marinating in psychoactive plant compounds all day, so I probably taste terrible anyway." The Shade Stalker leaned forward and delicately picked up one of the fruits with claws that could have disemboweled a tank. It bit down experimentally, and something remarkable happened. The creature's camouflage patterns shifted to display what could only be described as contentment. Bextal's worldview cracked like an eggshell and began leaking existential confusion all over his observation deck. "This is impossible," he whispered to the empty room. "Absolutely impossible. Predators don't make peace treaties." But as he watched, Finn and the Shade Stalker began what could only be described as an interspecies cultural exchange. The human shared his botanical knowledge, pointing out various plants and explaining their properties, while the creature demonstrated its hunting techniques with what appeared to be educational intent rather than predatory menace. "You see," Finn was saying, examining the Shade Stalker's camouflage cells through a magnifying glass, "your adaptive coloration works on the same principles as certain cephalopods on my world, but you've evolved it about 10,000 times more efficiently. The quantum chromophores in your skin are absolutely fascinating." The Shade Stalker, apparently pleased to finally meet someone who appreciated the finer points of its evolutionary advantages, began showing off. Its hide cycled through patterns that matched every major terrain type on Ixthanor Prime, then shifted to abstract geometries that were probably the equivalent of artistic expression. "Magnificent," Finn breathed. "You're not just a predator, you're a living artwork." Hours passed. The sun rose on what should have been the discovery of Finn's scattered remains, but instead revealed the human and the apex predator engaged in what appeared to be a nature documentary collaboration. Finn was taking detailed notes while the Shade Stalker demonstrated various hunting techniques on cooperative trees and rocks. Bextal's aide returned to find his commander staring at the screens with the expression of someone whose fundamental understanding of reality had been gently but thoroughly demolished. "Sir, how did the human's elimination proceed?" "It didn't," Bextal replied in the hollow voice of someone whose professional expertise had just been revealed to be completely worthless. "The human befriended it." "Befriended what, sir?" "The Shade Stalker. They're having what appears to be a scientific discussion about evolutionary biology." The aide's tentacles went limp with shock. That's not possible. The Shade Stalker doesn't have discussions, it has meals." "Apparently," Bextal said slowly, "we were wrong about a lot of things. The official test duration was 10 days, but Finn could have stayed indefinitely. He and the Shade Stalker had developed a working relationship that redefined the concept of apex predator dynamics. The creature had become his research assistant, guide, and apparently, friend. When Finn finally activated his extraction beacon on day 8, not because he was in danger, But because he'd collected enough botanical samples to keep researchers busy for decades, the Shade Stalker followed him to the pickup zone like a loyal companion. The extraction team arrived to find Finn calmly cataloging his plant samples while a 6-meter death machine lounged nearby like an oversized guard dog. The pilot's hands shook so badly he nearly crashed the transport before Finn assured him that his research partner was completely harmless. Harmless? Bextal's voice crackled through the comm system. That creature has eliminated every candidate we've ever sent. Well, yes, Finn replied reasonably, because they all tried to fight it or hide from it. I asked it nicely if we could work together instead. Turns out, it was just lonely. The Shade Stalker made a sound that was somewhere between a purr and a rumble, nuzzling Finn's shoulder with enough gentle affection to completely shatter the combat protocols of every military in the galaxy. Back at the facility, Finn politely declined the dozens of military recruitment offers that flooded in within hours of his success. The Hectare War Council wanted him to train their special forces. The Wyx-Loran Empire offered him a strategic position commanding their most elite units. Even the Cuvex Collective, despite their collective trauma from losing so many members, wanted to study his methods. That's very flattering, Finn told the assembled representatives, but I've got a research grant waiting back on Earth. There's this fascinating orchid in Borneo that might hold the key to developing new antibiotics. And frankly, that sounds more interesting than teaching people how to make friends with things that want to eat them. Bextal watched the human's transport disappear into hyperspace, then turned to observe his new problem. The Shade Stalker had taken up residence in the preserve's central clearing and was displaying clear signs of separation anxiety. The galaxy's most feared predator was moping. "Sir," his aide ventured carefully, "what do we do about the test site?" Bextal considered this. The Predator Gauntlet had been the ultimate test of survival, cunning, and combat prowess. But apparently, it was no match for a human who understood that sometimes the best way to survive wasn't to fight nature, but to ask it politely if you could be friends. "Retire it," he said finally. "Convert the preserve into a research station. I have a feeling we're going to need to study that human's methods very carefully." In the months that followed, Finn's approach revolutionized everything from military strategy to interspecies diplomacy. The Ortega Protocol became standard training for anyone operating in hostile environments. When facing an overwhelming predator, try offering it snacks and a compliment on its evolutionary advantages. It worked surprisingly often. The Shade Stalker, meanwhile, became the galaxy's first apex predator research consultant, helping scientists understand predator behavior while enjoying a steady supply of its favorite fruits and the occasional visiting botanist who appreciated its conversational skills. As for Finn Ortega, he returned to Earth with a backpack full of alien plant samples, a research paper that would revolutionize xenobiology, and the distinction of being the only being in galactic history to pass the Predator Gauntlet by making friends with the final boss. Sometimes, apparently, the best way to prove you're the apex species isn't to dominate everything else. It's to convince everything else that you're worth keeping around. 3 years after the Predator Gauntlet's closure, the galaxy still struggles to process what happened on Ixthanor Prime. Military academies have added mandatory courses on alternative engagement strategies, while the Galactic Survival Institute has been disbanded entirely. Its commanders quietly reassigned to positions where their expertise in orchestrating spectacular deaths might prove less embarrassing. The Shade Stalker, meanwhile, has become something of a celebrity. It regularly appears at xenobiology conferences via hologram, demonstrating hunting techniques for educational purposes while sporting what researchers have determined is the interspecies equivalent of a smile. Tourist bookings to Ixthanor Prime have increased by 4,000%, though visitors are strictly required to bring fruit offerings and demonstrate basic plant identification skills. Finn Ortega returned to his orchid research, blissfully unaware that his approach had spawned a new field of aggressive friendship tactics across 17 different military branches. His published paper, Collaborative Survival Strategies in Hostile Xenobiological Environments, became required reading at every major university, though most students still couldn't quite believe someone had survived a death world by offering snacks to the apex predator. Perhaps most tellingly, the betting pools that had given Finn 847-1 odds have since refused to accept wagers on any human participants in survival challenges, citing unfair advantages in the category of inexplicable friendliness.